What are the three bodies of the Buddha?
The concept of the three bodies, Trikaya, of the Buddha evolved as a way of explaining how the spiritual entity called the Buddha nature could transcend all earthly realities and at the same time manifest itself in the world. Pure Buddha nature existed in the Dharma body and was personified as the primal or universal Buddha, living in various heavenly abodes that made up the bliss body were the five principal meditational Buddhas. 1 ruling the center and 4 ruling the paradises at the 4 cardinal points. Transcendent Bodhisattvas assisted the celestial Buddhas in the work of salvation through grace. Involved in earthly affairs were the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who entered history in the manifestation body, subjecting themselves to time and change out of compassion for all suffering beings.
What is an icon?
Icon comes from the Greek word icon, meaning image or likeness. From around the 400s on, the use of colorful two-dimensional images of Christ, Mary and the saints became an essential part of Byzantine liturgical and devotional prayer. Most icons depict the sacred figure frontally, often displaying a very stylized face that directs a striking gaze at the viewer. Some have described the devotional act of venerating an icon as a process of seeing and being seen, almost as if the image had a life of its own. Artists who create icons are called iconographers, people who write with pictures. They undergo a long and very traditional course of training, steeped in spiritual practices of prayer and asceticism. They employ only natural materials in their art and follow strict canons concerning characteristic ways of depicting certain figures and specific prescriptions about size and proportions of the sacred figure's form. Many icons use gold leaf for the sky around the holy figure, an immediate clue that the world into which the artist invites the viewer is not that of everyday life, but a spiritual realm beyond this. In Orthodox and other Eastern Catholic churches, a screen called the iconostasis, place of the icons, stands between worshippers and the sacred action occurring on the altar beyond. In addition to individual icons placed on stands in various parts of the church, further mural-like images are displayed across the iconostasis.
When were instituted the first public schools in ancient China?
The first public schools date back to ancient China. Confucius was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man, including a peasant boy, had the potential to be a man of principle.
What does the word millennialism mean?
Millennialism, or millenarianism, refers to the general expectation that at a certain point in time human history will undergo a dramatic turnabout, resulting even in the very end of time itself and the beginning of another age. A millennium is literally a 1,000-year period, at the turning of which some communities of faith believe their historic expectation of a new dispensation will be realized. Naturally, the marking of millennial events depends on when a given religious tradition marks its own beginnings. The year 2000 has little or no religious meaning for the great majority of the world's peoples. For the most part, it is only some groups among the world's Christians who attach special significance to this event. But even for Christians the event is ambiguous since, due to anomalies in calendar calculations long ago, it is widely understood that the actual 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus has already come and gone. There is, however, a curiously broad appeal of the notion of millennium. Many have attached a vague sense of foreboding to its imminent arrival beyond concerns about the so-called Y2K computer bug. As we will see later, some traditions have a strong sense of the importance of historic expectation, even if that is not tied specifically to the turn of a true 1,000-year millennium.
What are some of the main features of Buddhism's relationships to other traditions?
Buddhism's most important connections historically have been with Hinduism, out of which it grew, and the major indigenous traditions of the Asian lands to which it spread. Over the centuries, Buddhists have therefore interacted primarily with Hindus, Deists, Confucians, and adherents of Shinto. An earlier question outlined crucial features Buddhism's relationship to Hinduism. Here are some features of Buddhism's conceptual connections with the other traditions. China's ancient deist tradition made room for the Buddha among the swelling ranks of its deities, even claiming that foundational figure Lao Tzu had himself become a Buddha. Dharma, some scholars argued, was the Buddhist analogy to the concept of the way or Dao. They suggested further parallels between the Buddhist Arhat and the deist immortal, and between nirvana and the concept of non-action. Confucian tradition also found ways of accommodating to the newcomer. Some scholars saw in Buddhist ethics a parallel to Confucian filial piety. Even though Buddhist elevation of celibate monasticism seemed quite irreconcilable with the Confucian emphasis on family life. To Buddhism's 5 precepts some likened Confucianism's 5 constant virtues. When Buddhist missionaries brought the new teaching to Japan, the Buddha met the kami, high beings, of the indigenous tradition called Shinto. As was so often the case in China and elsewhere, Buddhism's ability to survive and grow in its new environment depended a great deal on royal patronage. Imperial support gave impetus to various Buddhist Shinto accommodations. Shinto's sun goddess, Amaterasu, became a counterpart to the Buddha of infinite light, Vairochana. Hachiman, Shinto deity of war, dressed as a Buddhist monk and became the guardian of the great Buddha. And in Mahayana teachings multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas some saw parallels to Shinto's countless kami. Representatives of various Buddhist denominations have continued active dialogue with other traditions, especially through the monastic connection.
Who were the Essenes?
One day in 1949 a young Bedouin herded his flock in the wilderness of Judea. Near the northwestern end of the Dead Sea, at a place called Wadi Qumran. He amused himself, the story goes, by tossing stones into some of the many caves nearby. After one toss he heard the sound of something breaking deep in a cave. Inside he found a cache of covered clay jars containing very old manuscripts. Fortunately for us all, the shepherd gave most of them to people who might be able to make sense of them. The treasure, now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, has proved a gold mine of information about a strange and little-known religious community that had lived at Qumran. It appears that the Essenes lived an ascetic, semi-monastic life in communities that flourished from around 150 BCE to 75 CE. Numbering about 4,000 at one time, this small Jewish sect accepted only male adults to full membership. Though some members were apparently married. The Essenes are perhaps the closest analogy to a form of monastic life in the Jewish tradition. As Jews they studied Torah and observed strict purity in ritual practice, but did not participate in temple worship in Jerusalem. Belief in immortality of the soul and the eventual resurrection of the body were central to their theology.
What are the other great feasts of pilgrimage and remembrance?
The Feast of Shavuot, weeks, begins 7 weeks after Passover. Originally coinciding with the wheat harvest, the Feast of Weeks recalls Israel's spiritual harvest of the divine law at Sinai. The feast occurs on Sivan 6th, a day longer outside Israel. The 50th day, Pentecost in Greek, after Passover, marking the end of the days of the Omer, sheaf. In reference to the ancient practice of bringing the first sheaves of barley as temple offering. The third of the great holidays is Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. 5 days after the Day of Atonement, from Tishri 15 to 23, a day longer outside Israel except in Reform congregations. Jews celebrate this harvest festival marking the end of the vintage season. Many families construct small symbolic structures in the backyard, recalling as they take their meals there how God sheltered the people through the wilderness of the Exodus. Along with Passover and weeks, this was a pilgrimage feast before the destruction of the temple, when many traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate. Families bless 4 plants as symbols of unity in diversity. holding in the left hand a citrus called the ethrig, and in the right a bound cluster of 1 palm, 2 willow, and 3 myrtle branches, together called the lulav. They make gestures of blessing and sing Hosanna, save us.
What is Neo-Daoism?
Neo-Daoism is a name commonly given to various developments around the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Some scholars suggest that there were 2 recognizable schools. One was called secret mystical teaching, Xian Shui. According to some interpreters, an important theme was its emphasis on the quest for physical immortality. Earlier Daoist sources had spoken of immortality, but generally of the spiritual rather than the bodily sort. Neo-Daoism recommended exercises in breathing, diet, use of potions, elixirs, and talismans, and sexual activity reminiscent of Hindu and Buddhist tantric practices. But perhaps more fundamental in this alchemy were intense meditative practices intended to reveal the Dao within the individual. Some scholars interpret Xian Shui as developing out of Confucian rather than Daoist thought. A major feature of the second school, known as pure conversation, Qingtian, is its attempts to blend aspects of Daoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. Among its proponents were the so-called 7 sages of the bamboo grove, whose penchant for detached philosophical discourse and the cultivation of a Daoist aesthetic were among their hallmarks. On the basis of their reading of the Zhuangzi and Dao De Jing, they developed a neo-Daoist interpretation of the so-called Confucian classics. After the 5th century, Buddhist concepts infiltrated the movement to such a degree that Neo-Daoism gradually lost its distinctiveness and identity.
What is meant by the term the rapture?
Some millenarian sects hold that at the second coming of Christ all believers will be taken up, rapt, into heaven. Only those deemed to be saved will enjoy the benefit of the experience. Numbers of the saved and the criteria by which to determine one's own or others' membership in that group vary. Some churches adhere to a literal reading of the scriptural text, according to which 144,000, equal numbers from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, will be sealed on their foreheads, Revelation 7:1-8. Strict interpretations limit to that number those who will survive the Great Tribulation. Revelation 7:14, that will precede the second coming of Christ. Others allow that the number is symbolic, though the actual number of those saved will remain relatively small.
Who are Theravada Buddhists?
Theravada Buddhists are members of a more or less homogeneous community of faith and Worship built around the notion that the Buddha was a human being who taught by example. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was the last of many non-human and human reincarnations of the Buddha to be a separate school from the Second Council on in the 4th century BCE. Their main scriptures are called collectively the Pali Canon. Theravadins seek deliverance from rebirth by eliminating craving and ignorance through self-discipline. The ideal and model of the enlightened life is the Arhat. Arhats benefit others chiefly by their example, and they possess no saving power as such. They embody primarily the virtue of wisdom. Their ultimate goal, nirvana, is a state beyond this world of samsara in which the liberated person experiences neither desire nor impressions of any kind. Theravada sources describe nirvana as a permanent pleasant state of knowledge, freedom, and peace that is largely the result of a process of personal effort. When Theravadins pray, their primary intent is more to honor the Buddha than to worship him. All good acts, including religious ritual, done with proper intent can help one gain merit toward the eradication of negative karma. For most Theravada Buddhists, the concepts of merit making and merit transfer are more basic and accessible than the kind of lofty ethical and spiritual discipline embodied in an Arhat. There are, of course, some regional and cultural variations in Theravada expression and practice, but considerably less so than in the other main branches of Buddhist tradition.
Are there Hindu fundamentalists?
If fundamentalism may be defined as an aggressive and intolerant religious exclusivism, there are several manifestations of it in the history of Hinduism. A 19th century reformist movement called the Arya Samaj, Society of Aryans, sought to cleanse modern Hindu thought and practice of unnecessary clutter that had contaminated the tradition over the centuries. The society condemned not only Muslims and Christians but members of various Hindu denominations as well. To its great credit, the Arya Samaj attempted to make Hindu practice more egalitarian, giving women and socially marginal groups equal access. Another fundamentalist style force in recent times has been the political faction called Bharatiya Janata or BJP. In 1992 the party supported agitation by the militant Vishva Hindu Parishad, Universal Hindu Assembly, to destroy a 16th century mosque in Ayodhya. They wanted to replace the mosque with a temple to Rama and to rededicate the site as Rama's birthplace, which Muslims had desecrated centuries before. The VHP throws its considerable weight behind political candidates who promise to do whatever is necessary to keep power in the hands of Hindus.
What do Confucians believe about ultimate spiritual reality?
Two of the most important concepts that define what Confucius and his followers thought about ultimate spiritual reality are the Dao and heaven, Tian. Confucian texts do not always make clear how the two differ, and at times it seems they are virtually interchangeable. In Confucian teaching, the Dao and heaven are generally non-personal realities that are equivalent, respectively, to a primordial or eternal cosmic law, Dao, and the source of that law, heaven. Early Confucian texts emphasize the immanent, rather than the transcendent, aspect of the Dao. For example, Confucius is reported to have observed that the Dao is very close to human beings. Dao is therefore accessible and knowable, but that does not mean the Dao is not also mysterious. Confucius did not simply deny the existence of transcendent realities. He preferred to interpret ultimate reality from the ground up, so to speak. Many of history's great theologians have constructed their systems of thought by beginning with the existence of some divine reality and working their way down. Not Confucius. He was interested primarily in the ethical implications of traditional teachings that he had inherited. He apparently thought of heaven as the ultimate moral authority or principle. Heaven makes its will known to, and through, an upright sovereign. What heaven discloses is, in turn, the Dao. Confucius reportedly described his Dao as consisting of two fundamental ethical components: responsibility or loyalty, Yung, and reciprocity, Shu. His interpretation of Dao and heaven is therefore quite different from the traditional Daoist interpretation. In much of Daoist thought, Dao has priority and gives rise to heaven, which in turn manifests the 10,000 things that many people call creation or the universe.
What were the accomplishments of the Tang dynasty?
The Tang, 617 to 907 CE, was the sixth to last Chinese dynasty. It is well known because the period saw great achievements in government and business as well as in letters and the arts. Considered a golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang was also an age of great expansion. At its height, the empire stretched from Turkmenistan in the west to Korea, which was a vassal state, in the east, and from Manchuria to northern India. One historian called the Tang the consummate Chinese dynasty, formidable, influential, and innovative. One of the Tang's innovations was the balance of administrative power. Government was separated into three main branches: the Imperial Secretariat, which organized the emperor's directives into policies; the Imperial Chancellery, which reviewed the policies and monitored the bureaucracy; and the Department of States and Affairs, which carried out the policies through the administration of 6 ministries. One of the most forward-thinking developments of the Tang dynasty was the growth of a civil service. Candidates for public service were trained in the Confucian principles before they took an examination that would qualify them for official duty.
Have relics ever been important for Muslims?
Popular Islamic spirituality in many parts of the world has included devotional practices associated with the tombs of holy persons. People visit the shrines of the friends of God in hopes of gaining blessings and other special favors as a result of saintly intercession. Many of these shrines hold items the saint is believed to have owned, such as headgear, a special symbolic frock called the kurka, walking staff, begging bowl, prayer beads, or symbolic weapon. Devotees who come to the shrines sometimes receive an object, such as a simple head wrapping or other token, that has been in contact with the holy person's tomb. Only one object has been similarly associated with Muhammad. Since the 13th century, Turkish Muslims believed they owned the so-called mantle of the Prophet, a green robe now in the possession of the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul. People there and in many other countries still recite a traditional poem called the Burda. Mantle poem, during the observance of Muhammad's birthday. But the mantle itself has never been the focus of devotional practice, as have the relics of many friends of God. Sacred footprints function in Islamic tradition, as in many others as well, like relics. Pilgrims to Mecca say special prayers at the Station of Abraham just opposite the door of the Kaaba. A small glass and gold-colored cupola covers a small stone said to contain footprints God caused Abraham to leave in the softened stone as a proof of his prophethood. Tradition says that as Muhammad rose heavenward on his ascension, he left still visible prints in the large stone beneath the dome of the rock. Muhammad's footprints became the inspiration for several types of visual symbolism still popular in North Africa, for example. Footprints of Ali have likewise been at the devotional center of a number of shrines.
Are dreams and visions important in Hindu tradition?
Dreams and visions are often described as the means by which particularly holy individuals receive special knowledge or responsibilities. Spiritually advanced members of different denominations describe experiences in which their particular chosen deity appears and manifests his or her divine form. The deity's desires for the founding of a temple in a particular place are often communicated in dreams or visions. Traditional Hindu psychology considers dreaming one of the four ordinary states of consciousness. Founders of various denominations and sects often report dreams or visions as the impetus for a personal conversion or for proclaiming a new teaching.
Have dreams and visions or other spirit manifestations been important in Shinto tradition?
Shinto legends are full of famous figures who have enjoyed or barely survived encounters with the spirit world. Many religiously prominent individuals have claimed to receive divine visitations. and privileged communications in dreams. Various spirits, even evil ones, Goryo, are capable of making their presence known for the purpose of delivering a message. These spirits, also called living human kami, arahitogame, can return in their human form to make things both positive and negative happen in the land of the living. Certain famous people, like Prince Shotoku Taishi, 574 to 622, and poet calligrapher Sugawara Michizane, 845 to 903, to whom over 10,000 shrines are dedicated, who died untimely or violent deaths later became kami, but could also exert unhappy influence if not dealt with properly. This is a striking amalgam of positive and negative powers in one spirit. Such a spirit can manifest itself in frightening apparitions as well as in blessings.
How did so many different Christian churches come into being?
Three major points of division mark the history of Christianity, and nearly all of the tradition's diverse branches derive from those critical events. Intense controversy over the theological identity of Jesus culminated in the Council of Chalcedon. In present-day Turkey, in 451, decrees of the council taught definitively that Jesus was one person possessing both human and divine natures. In so doing, Chalcedon ruled against both the Nestorian heresy and the various monophysite Christians. The former taught that Jesus was two distinct persons in one. Modern-day Nestorians call themselves Assyrian Christians. According to the latter, Christ was not human at all. Today the many originally monophysite churches include Coptic and Abyssinian groups in Egypt and Ethiopia, Syrian Jacobites, and the Armenian Orthodox Church. Even though the majority of these groups eventually came to accept Chalcedon's formulation, the initial effect of the council was to separate what have come to be the indigenous Middle Eastern churches from the rest of Mediterranean Christendom. A second point of division came officially in 1054, the culmination of centuries of disagreement, both theological and political, between the Rome-based Western Church and the Constantinople-based Eastern Church. Pope Leo IX, 1049-54, sent emissaries to excommunicate the Eastern Patriarch on the basis of his refusal to accept changes in the language of the Nicene Creed. Finally, the largest of all the divisions was set in motion by several 14th-15th century Christian reformers, including John Wycliffe, c. 1329-84, and John Huss, c. 1369-1415. And culminating in the work of Martin Luther, 1483-1546, John Calvin, 1509-1564, and Henry VIII, 1491-1547, of England.
Have there ever been schisms or heresies in Hinduism?
Toward the end of the Vedic period we find the first clear references to groups called Nastikas. Those who deny or naysayers. Early Jains and Buddhists represented the most important of the non-orthodox groups that eventually developed into distinct religious traditions. Nastikas are generically distinguished from the Astikas, those who affirmed the authority of the Vedas, the existence of an indestructible soul, and the existence of God as an essential salvific power. Exponents of Brahmanic or priestly Hinduism have had a particularly large stake in combating the erosive influence of various nonconformist sectarian developments over many centuries. Some have eventually been reabsorbed into the greater Hinduism while others, such as Buddhism and Jainism, have remained distinct.
What is the difference between a sermon and a homily?
In general, sermons tend to be longer and organized around a doctrinal or moral theme. Homilies may be lengthy, but they are generally situated in the context of a larger liturgical service. Whereas sermons as often as not are the main focus of a worship gathering. Sermons frequently take as their subject a line or somewhat longer passage from Scripture. The homily form seeks to comment on and elucidate a pair or set of scriptural texts, precisely as Scripture and not so much as a springboard for an ethical discourse. The preacher typically chooses the sermon's signature passage because of its theme, rather than because the text has come up in due course as part of a prearranged cycle of readings. Homilies are more often a way of helping the congregation appreciate how the selected readings fit together and comment on each other, and how they fit in the larger scheme of the liturgical cycle for the season at hand, such as Advent/Christmas, Lent/Easter, Ordinary Time.
What temple rites exists in Confucianism?
Confucian temples function principally as memorial halls. They are dedicated to the veneration and appreciation of the great sages, teachers and scholars of the tradition. Honoring the spirit and teaching of the great ones is not quite the same as praying to them in the way that some people pray to deities or to saints believed to have the power of intercession. Honoring the great Confucian figures generally lacks the kind of spontaneity one finds in the much busier Daoist and CCT temples. Confucian rituals tend to be more reserved and orderly and associated with specific occasions. Popular devotion, on the other hand, occurs virtually around the clock, 7 days a week.
Where do Christians live today? What are their estimated numbers?
Members of the several dozen major Christian churches and denominations live in virtually every country on the planet. As the largest single group of religious communities, People who identify themselves at least nominally as Christians number just under 2 billion. Christianity's numbers are expanding at a rate somewhat slower than that of the global Muslim community. Catholicism is the single largest Christian church, with around 1 billion members. Protestants combined number about a third of a billion, with Orthodox believers just under a quarter billion, with Russia's church the largest single body. The smallest Christian communities in major countries are those in Japan and China.
What does the term hierarchy mean? Which Christian groups are the most hierarchically structured? Which are the least?
Hierarchy comes from the Greek words for sacred leadership. Church organizations vary from predominantly egalitarian and democratic to highly structured and institutionalized. Even the most egalitarian tend to feature some sort of division of labor within their leadership. But they typically choose leaders from among the rank and file members. Roman Catholicism is perhaps the most hierarchically structured of the churches. A leader, called the Pope or Holy Father, has been elected since the Middle Ages, by a body called the College of Cardinals. The Pope is the ecclesiastical descendant of Peter and the custodian of apostolic tradition. Cardinals are specially appointed by the Pope from among the bishops and archbishops. Another rank of clerics have the honorific title of Monsignor, a designation until recently further divided into those called Right Reverend and a lower rank called Very Reverend. The office of priest, from which the upper levels of the hierarchy are taken, consists of men responsible for the day-to-day life of the church in its thousands of parishes. Another office, that of deacon, is just below that of priest. Men studying for the priesthood are ordained as temporary deacons, but more recently the office of permanent deacon has been made up of laymen chosen and trained for the work of assisting parish priests. Several other churches retain a highly structured organization, but generally on a smaller scale. For example, many have archbishops and bishops as main administrators. Many of the Eastern Orthodox churches are governed by patriarchs, to whom archbishops, or metropolitans, and bishops report.
Are doctrine and dogma the same thing?
Doctrine in its general sense means teaching or instruction, from the Latin doctrina, both as an activity and as collection of specific beliefs or principles. It is sometimes used in a non-religious sense, as in the geopolitical posture called the Monroe Doctrine, a warning that other governments that exert undue influence in the Americas should not be surprised if the United States pushes back. As a religious concept, doctrine means specifically all the individual teachings that a tradition identifies as essential.
What other early scriptures are especially important for Shinto practitioners? Is there a Shinto scriptural canon?
Scholars refer to the various sacred texts collectively as Shinton, texts of the deities. But although they generally agree on the importance of a certain set of works, there has never been an official process of canonization by which representatives of the tradition have formally declared certain texts as definitive. Here are the most important of the classical documents. From the early 8th century, the Fudoki, records of wind and earth, provided data about very early religious rituals from major shrines. The early 9th century Kogoshui, 807, or gleaning of ancient words commented on previous documents in an attempt to legitimate the Imbe family against their enemies, the Nakatomi clan. The Manyoshu, collection of countless leaves, anthologizes a large selection of 7th and 8th century Japanese poetry of various genres. Some Shinto scholars have insisted that these poems represent the purest form of Japanese literary expression. First published in 927, the Enji Shiki includes a collection of more than 24 prayer texts. A work called the Kyojiki, also Sendai Kyoji Hangi, or Records of Ancient Happenings, bears the date 620 but was probably contrived as late as the 9th century to compete with the similar sounding Kojiki in antiquity and authority. It amounts to what some traditions might call an apocryphal work, not what it claims to be, but still full of valuable material. Finally, a group of 13th century texts called the Five Shinto Scriptures, Shinto Gobusho, emphasize the antiquity of Japan's Shinto heritage. 17th century scholars who studied these texts as prime examples of Japanese culture and values went on to spearhead the national learning school of thought.
Do Hindus believe in miracles?
A special quality of Hindu belief generally is that all things, whether spiritual or material, result from the divine play or lila. God brings all things into being, sustains them for a time, then withdraws them from the realm of human experience, not by laboring, but as a kind of divine entertainment. That does not mean that God is cynical or cruel, dangling his creatures like so many marionettes. It means only that what we know as our world is the product of God's delight. Hindu tradition teaches that human beings are the beneficiaries of that delight. We are, in other words, invited to the party. The concept of miracle presupposes that human beings already know the limits of ordinary causality. From the Hindu perspective, that assumption is the height of arrogance because it suggests that human beings have things pretty well figured out, such as the causes and cures of disease, the roots of evil, and the wellsprings of good. One of the many aspects of the Hindu tradition's genius And one of its major contributions to humanity is that it refuses to close the door on surprise. All things, not merely the odd event that appears to defy the laws of nature, are cause for wonder. There is but one great miracle. God has chosen eternally to pour out the divine essence in its countless forms and enjoys doing so. What a gift of the ultimate perspective on life! To see it all as part of one great marvel and learn not to take oneself so seriously.
What is distinctive about Orthodox Judaism?
Emphasis on the direct, verbatim revelation of the Torah to Moses is the foundation of Orthodox Jewish tradition. Rabbinical interpretation of Torah serves the purpose of drawing out the meanings of Scripture so that every situation in life is anchored in divine revelation. If Scripture does not address an issue directly, the rabbi employs traditional principles of exegesis to make what limited adaptations are deemed necessary. Strict observance of the 613 commands and prohibitions contained in the Torah is perhaps the most significant feature of orthodoxy. As an increasingly distinctive approach, orthodoxy began to emerge in 18th century Europe. In response to the perception that Jews were being assimilated too rapidly into society at large, reform attempts to adapt ritual observance in early 19th century Europe elicited a strong reaction on the part of those who refused to acknowledge a need for more than the most minimal adaptation. Orthodox Jews consider their communities a last bastion of tradition in an increasingly secularized world. Just over 1 American Jew out of 10 belongs to an Orthodox synagogue.
How did the Buddha reinterpret Hindu teaching?
Key notions Siddhartha learned as a young Hindu included those of karma, action; dharma, law; samsara, cycles of rebirth; and moksha, final liberation. Most Hindus of his day understood the concept of karma as external, ritual action performed in the hope of tapping into divine power. Some religious thinkers were beginning to suggest that, along with ancient Vedic ritual under the direction of the priestly class, the acts of individual people might also influence their spiritual as well as material prospects. Others, like the Buddha, took their questioning of the old ways much further. They began to spiritualize the law of karma, explaining that choice and intent were more important than outward deeds. Along with their reinterpretation of karma, some contemporaries of the Buddha were also rethinking the Hindu concept of dharma. No longer merely the impersonal, inscrutable law of cosmic order. Dharma now took on a personal ethical dimension. In the Buddha's view, karma included all the results of each individual's choices. He emphasized the need to purify one's intentions of all self-centeredness. Perform each act purely because it is your dharma, not because you hope to gain personally. The Hindu notion of samsara meant that the souls of individuals who died unliberated from the negative effects of their past actions would return in another form. The Buddha understood samsara to mean not only the cycle of physical rebirths, but the whole series of interior or spiritual stages the individual went through on the way to enlightenment. Finally, the Hindu idea of moksha meant the release of the indestructible soul, Atman, of each individual from the cycle of samsara. The Buddha also taught the possibility of a final liberation, but he gave it an important twist. Genuine liberation meant the complete cessation of all craving, even of craving for liberation itself. He called that final freedom nirvana, no wind, symbolizing the extinction of the flames of desire.
How would you sum up Confucianism's historical relationships to other traditions?
Confucianism's most important and enduring interreligious relations have been with Buddhism and Taoism. There have been periods during which Confucians have had more or less cordial dealings with representatives of the other two ways of China. But since so much has often been at stake, especially in terms of imperial patronage, Confucian scholars have frequently leveled serious criticisms at Taoist and Buddhist views. For example, Confucians have sometimes faulted Buddhism for being too otherworldly, too disconnected from the ordinary problems and needs of regular people. Confucians generally interpreted the Buddhist ideal of celibate monastic life as an abdication of filial devotion and the responsibility to perpetuate the family lineage. Taists, on the other hand, have characteristically struck Confucians as naive in their conviction that, if left to themselves, people will naturally follow an exemplary leader. Taoism's emphasis on doing things nature's way leaves society too vulnerable to simple lawlessness. In addition, the Confucian tradition's strong emphasis on education seemed to many to be irreconcilable with Taoism's more organic and seemingly anti-intellectual approach to learning. When Confucian tradition began to come into prominence during Japan's Tokugawa era, it found an increasingly hostile official response from representatives of Shinto. Confucianism, Shinto authorities argued, was a non-Japanese influence and therefore undesirable. By that time, however, Confucius had already made an indelible impression on Japanese society.
Are there anything like denominations or sects within Greater Hinduism?
Mark Twain once observed that compared to India, other lands and cultures were paupers in religion. He was referring to the large number of major religious traditions that have been born in India or had a significant impact in Indian history. Hindu tradition alone accounts for an astounding diversity. Most Hindus belong to one of two major denominations, called Sampradaya in Sanskrit, handing down, tradition. Devotees of Vishnu and his various manifestations or avatars are called Vaishnavites, or Vaishnavas. Shaivites, or Shaivas, are those for whom Shiva and the various names and forms of divinity associated with him offer the path to salvation. Two other smaller groups within the greater Hinduism are also important. Hindus who focus on the feminine manifestations of Shiva's divine power, Shakti, are called Shaktas. Shaktism is also sometimes called Tantrism because of its connection with a category of esoteric scriptures called Tantras. So-called right-handed Shaktas espouse practices very much like the other Bhakti traditions, emphasizing worship of the goddess. Sects described as left-handed tend to be more secretive and esoteric. Finally, the term smarta as it is commonly used now refers to Hindus for whom the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, represents the greatest hope of spiritual realization. Some smartas adhere to the Advaita or monistic philosophical teaching of Shankara. Others are devotionally and ritually eclectic, focusing on one of 5 names and forms of God: Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, Ganesha, and Surya, as their chosen deity. These 4 designations are still very broad groupings, each of which is made up of a number of sub-denominations or sects.
Are there any other important deist sacred figures?
One important subordinate deity is Xiantian Shangdi, Supreme Emperor of Dark Heaven. The Jade Emperor dispatched him to Earth to battle a band of renegade demon kings. His iconography shows him enthroned and using a serpent and a turtle, leaders of the demons, as a footstool. A legendary woman named Shi Wangmu, also known as the Queen Mother of the West, figures prominently in some deist writings. She is a patroness of immortality, often depicted in the company of jade maidens, one carrying a fan and the other a bushel of the peaches of longevity. Ruling the east is her divine consort, Dung Wan Gong, who lives in the remote magical fastness of the Kunlun Mountains. In a reversal of the more usual dynamic, a god of walls and moats, also known as the city god, began as a popular deity and made his way into the deist pantheon. During certain periods in history, the heavenly master appointed a given city's tutelary deity. City god has the assistance of several other figures, called spirit secretaries, in the idiom of public administration. They help the city god deliver his reports on the conduct of citizens to the authorities in hell. A goddess named Domu, mother of the bushel of stars, or northern dipper, functions in Daoism much the way Guanyin does in Buddhism, offering limitless compassion for the suffering. Some other potent beings are clustered in groups. The Sennin are a group of sacred figures who dwell in heaven or in the distant misty mountains. Among the Sennin the most important are the 8 immortals. Originally persons either historical, 3, or legendary. 5, they function as guardian figures of Daoism. Although they are not officially divine, popular lore sometimes attributes divine powers to them. They are called later heaven deities, as are all human figures who eventually achieved immortality.
Do Muslims ever visit their holy cities outside of the formal pilgrimage season?
Hajj, or major pilgrimage, fulfills a religious duty only in connection with the formal season. But travelers to the holy city can perform the Umrah or lesser pilgrimage any time of year. Umrah is a strictly devotional activity, optional but highly recommended. Rituals include a much scaled-down version of important Hajj activities. To be more precise, Umrah is actually a component of Hajj that can be performed separately. Pilgrims enter into the state of ritual consecration by donning the same seamless white cloth worn for Hajj. Before entering the sacred zone surrounding Mecca, they proceed to the Kaaba, circumambulate it 7 times, perform 2 cycles of ritual prayer, take a drink from the well of Zamzam, and walk rapidly 7 times between the small hillocks called Marwa and Safa. They conclude the lesser pilgrimage by clipping a lock of hair or shaving the head, symbolizing the spiritual change desired as a result of the pilgrimage. As at Hajj time, many pilgrims add a visit to the Prophet's mosque in Medina. But that is a separate devotional activity.
Do Hindus really believe in and worship many gods?
Hindu tradition uses language and symbolism that seems at first glance to suggest what is called polytheism, worship of many deities. Most Hindus, however, will tell you they believe in God, one transcendent spiritual reality. Since human beings are incapable of grasping the fullness of divine truth in anything like a comprehensive and definitive way, believers are left with a basic choice: either they keep quiet about matters of faith and belief altogether, since the realities will forever elude ordinary language and symbolism, or they indulge in ordinary forms of expression, ever aware that those forms will never be adequate. Hindu tradition has become a monument to the second option, and the world of religious belief is all the richer for that.
Are there Shinto hierarchical structures?
Like so many other religious traditions, Shinto community structures often reflect the belief that human life mirrors divine life. Just as there is at least an implicit hierarchy among divine beings, human society needs a certain degree of structure. Long-standing Japanese tradition, much influenced and reinforced by Confucian teaching over the centuries, lays great emphasis on knowing one's place in society. Each individual stands in a relationship of higher to lower, or vice versa, with his or her fellow human beings. And basic etiquette requires that one be aware of social subordination in every context. Everyday Japanese speech, with its various levels of polite address, reflects that awareness. Although contemporary Japan is a democratic society, with all the political institutions needed to support a democracy, hierarchy runs deep in the culture, and so too in Shinto belief and practice. Everything, from ranks within the network of shrines to division of labor among ritual specialists, mirrors that awareness of multi-level structure in society at large. For several centuries in the early history of Shinto, 4 groups were responsible for most Shinto ritual. The Nakatomi family oversaw ritual generally, the Imbe family were concerned with maintaining ritual purity. The Urabe family focused on divinatory rituals so as to know the divine intentions in all matters. And shrine musicians performed the divine entertainments. Other powerful clans or families held and relinquished positions of power and influence over subsequent centuries.
What is eschatology?
Eschatology derives from 2 Greek words meaning the study, logos, of the last things, eschata. The so-called 4 last things include death, judgment, heaven, and hell, and the study of them is often called individual eschatology. In addition, cosmic eschatology encompasses religious teaching concerning how history and the world as we know it will come to an end. Although use of the term eschatology has been especially characteristic of the study of the Abrahamic traditions, it can also be useful in describing important aspects of belief in the religious traditions of Asian origin. Religious traditions of Middle Eastern origin have generally developed linear views of history, whereby time is said to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, never again to be repeated. Their eschatologies explore the final and definitive transformations that will befall both individuals and the universe. Traditions of Asian origin tend to favor cyclical views of time. Although each cycle of time is unimaginably long, it is only part of a vast unending potentiality for further variations. As a result, though Asian traditions do talk of various realms of reward and punishment hereafter, they generally do not consider any of those realms to be a truly final destination for the individual. There is always the possibility of yet another existence and another outcome. Many traditions talk of an accountability after death, often describing it as a meeting between the individual soul and a judge or council charged with meting out just deserts. Only a few traditions worldwide, such as Japan's Shinto, have weakly developed notions of afterlife.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Muslim?
Muslim men and women sometimes wear items or styles of clothing that clearly set them apart from non-Muslims. Stop by the local mosque on Friday afternoon and you will invariably find men arriving For the congregational prayer, wearing long flowing gowns and small knit or other fabric caps that cover most of the head. In honor of Muhammad's practice of covering his head during prayer. Men of Southern Asian origin, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, sometimes wear a kind of boat-shaped cap commonly worn back home. In some parts of the world, men who have made the Hajj signify their status as Hajis by wearing a burgundy fez wrapped in a white cloth. The rimless fez became popular because it was practical for use during prostration in prayer, allowing easy contact of the forehead with the ground. More than likely, the women attending a mosque will be wearing some form of head covering and an ankle-length dress or tunic with slacks. In many instances, the choice of distinctive garb is related to an individual's personal devotion and desire to symbolize his or her commitment to Islamic religious and social values. Most items of clothing are best understood as traditional rather than inherently religious, since they carry no explicit and uniquely Islamic symbolism. However, many Muslim women and men wear various items of jewelry bearing Islamic symbols. Most common are rings, pendants, and bracelets containing religious words or phrases in Arabic. Some show a star within a crescent moon, a symbol some interpret as a reference to the astronomical signs that mark the onset of the month of Ramadan. Favorite texts include the word Allah, phrases such as Insha'Allah, God willing, the Shahada, names of Muhammad and the four rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Muslim designers produce a wide range of religious adornment and market them through an increasing number of suppliers and boutiques that advertise in Muslim publications worldwide.
Where do members of local Daoist communities and members of CCT come together?
By far the most important Daoist and CCT gathering places are local temples and shrines, as well as the elaborate but temporary altars set up in open spaces for the larger religious ceremonies. Temples vary in size and wealth and, naturally, the smaller the temple the more likely it is to serve a purely ritual purpose and not to have room for other activities. Community temples at the center of towns and villages often serve as multi-purpose facilities. There might be any number of functions going on at one time: classes for children, play during recess, community meetings while worshippers attend to their devotional needs. In larger towns and cities, other organizations, such as various Daoist and Buddhist associations, apparently fill some of those communal functions as well. Most people still think of Daoist and CCT temples primarily as ritual facilities that also serve as centers of parish life. Temples typically govern their ordinary affairs through an elected committee, entrusted with all major decisions about ritual calendar, maintenance, and finance.